I suspect others will continue to join us in the next few minutes, but I have a somewhat lengthy introduction, so that will be all right. So good morning or evening or afternoon, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. My name is Terrell Haberkorn, and I'm a professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the second lecture in the Thinking Rights, Writing Justice series, organized by the Justice in Southeast Asia Lab, or JC Lab. The JC Lab is part of a 5-year initiative on social justice housed in the Center for Southeast Asian Studies and the Human Rights Program at UW-Madison and generously funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. A combination of intensive exchange between faculty and graduate students and public-facing events that aim to foster significant collaboration between academics and practitioners, the JC Lab reflects both the recognition that a growing number of MAs and PhDs in Southeast Asian studies are choosing to pursue professional careers outside the university, and that there is a need for academic work to be directly responsive to ongoing social justice crises in the region. We're currently publishing an online open access translation series, Justice in Translation, of both central and marginal texts from the region. And as I often will say, if you have a translation languishing in your drawer, we would love to have it. Other activities include this lecture series, an online reading group, and additional exchange activities between scholars and practitioners. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's event. Our online lecture series this year is focused on fighting authoritarianism in the Philippines. Professor Jojo Abinales spoke last week, and after tonight, there will be a 2-week pause. Our next lecture will be 2 weeks from today with Dr. Mary McCoy, and then 1 day later, Professor Aries Arugay. So it is the month of April is one in which we are trying to shine a light on ongoing authoritarianism and the ways in which people are documenting fighting it. I am so pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Sol Iglesias, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of the Philippines in Diliman, having joined the faculty in 2021. She has a PhD in Southeast Asian Studies and an MA in Political Science from the National University of Singapore, as well as an MA in International Affairs from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and a BA in Public Administration from the University of the Philippines. She won an American Political Science Association Asia Program Fellowship in 2021 and was selected as an emerging scholar on democracy and autocracy by the APSA Democracy and Autocracy Committee in 2020. She was also selected as a Southeast Asia Research Group or SEAREG Fellow in 2017. She is a core group member of the Network in Defense of Historical Truth and Academic Freedom and lead author of the Philippine Case in the 2022 Free to Think report of Scholars at Risk. She has published extensively on political violence in the Philippines, as well as Philippine current affairs and politics. She's currently completing a book entitled How a Weak State Governs, the Dynamics of Violence in Philippine Politics, on the central local interactions that produced violence in the democratic interregnum between the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. and the authoritarian regime of Rodrigo Duterte. She will also be joining us in Madison as a visiting fellow of the JC Lab later this year. So she will speak for roughly 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box at any time. That's the mode that we will use. And so now, Sol, please let me pass the screen to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Terrell. Thank you for the kind invitation and for asking me to contribute to this lecture series. And Terrell, really, for animating the truly wonderful work that the Justice in Southeast Asia Lab is doing at UW-Madison. I'd also like to thank G.J. Guillermo for his assistance in monitoring threats to academic freedom incidents, as well as Romel Rodriguez for generously sharing his unpublished manuscript, Kalatas, with me for this discussion today. I'd like to thank Scholars at Risk and the Network in Defense of Historical Truth and Academic Freedom for the solidarity. So the 2022 national and local elections in the Philippines returned the Marcos dynasty to power, decades after a popular revolt ousted dictator Ferdinand Marcos in 1986. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. won as president with 31.6 million votes, almost 60% of ballots cast. along with his running mate, Sara Duterte Carpio, who is the daughter of Marcos Jr.'s predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte. So how has a Marcos return affected Philippine politics? And why does this even matter? First of all, the election of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. almost a year ago now has come after a period of pronounced democratic backsliding in the Philippines under Rodrigo Duterte. Democratic backsliding is a deterioration in the quality of a country's democracy. So think of the US under Trump or Brazil under Bolsonaro. But a deterioration in the quality of democracy without a sharp collapse back to authoritarian rule. So what used to happen more in the past, what we would observe more, would be a coup d'etat in which the military takes over, or an autogolpe or self-coup in which an executive stages a power grab, as Marcos Sr. did in 1972 by declaring martial law and staying in office as president, instead of stepping aside at the end of his final term for new elections. Instead, we see tactics like executive aggrandizement, as Duterte did. So attacking institutions of checks and balances by cowing the Senate and the House of Representatives and the judiciary into submission for most of his time in office. More than that, by embracing the elder Marcos's legacy and midwifing the Marcos restoration, for example, by instigating Marcos Sr.'s burial in the Libingan ng mga Bayani as a hero, the National Hero Cemetery, Duterte attacked the very norms of democracy. And by waging a so-called war on drugs that left thousands summarily killed in the streets, Duterte attacked a core democratic principle that human life matters, and the state cannot arbitrarily take a person's life from them. So while Duterte did vacate the presidential Palace Malacanang to a duly elected successor, Marcos Jr., Marcos Jr. is an ally whose government has consistently protected Duterte from the International Criminal Court investigation into crimes against humanity in the Philippines, particularly because of the war on drugs. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the vice president is Duterte's daughter, Sara. So democratic backsliding in the Philippines, moreover, is part of the shrinking democratic space in Southeast Asia, which has experienced rising levels of repression, conflict, and massive human rights violations in recent years. And ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has a long history of authoritarian regimes covering each other's backs. So one more electoral autocracy or an illiberal democracy, whichever way you want to classify the Philippines these days, it means even less pressure for democratic reform in the region. So this lecture is divided into 4 parts. First, I'll give a brief and basic context for the benefit of those less familiar with the Philippines. Second, I'll talk about a few cases of threats to academic freedom that my colleagues and I have monitored during both the previous government under Duterte and Marcos, mainly cases in which scholars have been red tagged as communists or subversive. Third, I'll explain why contestation over the meaning and memory of martial law and Marcos rule tends to constrain academic freedom, just as it constrains dissent. And fourth, I'll conclude by exploring how revisionism provokes dissent and resistance as well. Well, so the Philippines has a democratic tradition, even if it's flawed and oligarchic, that predates the authoritarian period under Marcos Sr. Elections had been contests between 2 loosely structured parties made up of political factions, and as Thompson observes, these were not ideologically distinguishable and were weakened by constant turncoatism. So in other words, the Philippines has traditionally had very weak political party system institutionalization. Ferdinand Marcos was elected first in 1965, and then using electoral overspending and military intimidation to retain office, He was re-elected in 1969 for a final term, according to constitutional rules. But in 1970, the process of amending the Constitution was initiated, which in the recollection of a student activist at the time, and I quote, kept the entire country politically engaged, with politically nerves increasingly taut. The Constitutional Convention created expectations that the rules could change, giving Marcos a chance to remain in office and fomenting unrest as Marcos increasingly relied on the military and coercion. But instead, Marcos didn't wait for the Constitutional Convention to run its course. Marcos declared martial law on September 23, 1972. In a 1981 book, Progress and Martial Law, that Marcos himself wrote, he justifies the move in response to threats from both the left and the right. So he says in this book, when one looks back in contemplation of the choices laid before the country, the alternatives to martial law were a rightist coup or the election of Aquino, his nemesis, who we'll talk about more later, that would have been followed by the declaration of martial law anyway, and the subsequent strengthening of the exploitative oligarchic order. Or another option, a communist takeover. Thus, he says, we have met the threats of sedition and secession, giving us the time and opportunity to reconstruct a new society from the ashes of the old and create a more congenial environment that is conducive to sustained economic and social growth. In fact, however, Marcos had already signed Proclamation 1081 declaring martial law earlier on September 21st, but only announced it on the 23rd, ostensibly in response to an ambush of Juan Ponce Enrile, his Secretary of Defense, and what he argued was a sign that the country was on the brink of subversive anarchy, and so order had to be restored. In other words, Marcos declared martial law on paper, giving as his reason an event that had not even happened yet. However, it is well documented and later admitted by Enrile himself that the ambush was faked to provide Marcos a pretext to imposing martial rule. Make it look good, Marcos had instructed Enrile over the phone on the night of the ambush. In the 1976 book, The Conjugal Dictatorship, former Marcos propagandist Primitivo Mijares furthermore explains that the timing of the fake ambush, saying that the primary consideration was opposition leader Senator Ninoy Aquino's arrest. This was of utmost importance. So Mijares says that Aquino was number one in the order of battle outlined in accordance with the martial law plan. And the martial law declaration had to be timed with a Senate session so that Aquino's whereabouts could be easily ascertained for arrest. Mijares quips, the Enrile ambush had to be staged so that Aquino could be caged. Along with Aquino, other senators, activists, students, academics were arrested. According to task force detainees of the Philippines, there were 6,672 people arrested throughout the course of the Marcos dictatorship. 444 individuals were forcibly disappeared. There were 1,365 victims of extrajudicial killings or salvagings, and 968 were killed in massacres. Overall, the Human Rights Victims Claims Board that was formed much later after the dictatorship, the board identified 11,103 legitimate claims to a range of human rights violations. Now, going back to Aquino, in 1980, Aquino was allowed to leave for the United States for medical treatment after suffering from a heart attack while in detention. But when he tried to return to the Philippines, Aquino was assassinated at the Manila International Airport on August 21st, 1983. In 1986, his widow, Cory Aquino, ran against Marcos in snap elections. According to independent poll watchers, she won. According to the Marcos government, he won. precipitating mass demonstrations along the Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, or EDSA, the main arterial road in Metro Manila, as well as elsewhere in the country. On the fourth day of mass protests, US government helicopters airlifted Marcos and his family from the Malacanang Palace on February 25, 1986. It was during this time that Enrile, going back to Juan Ponce Enrile, publicly confessed to faking the ambush as a pretext for military rule back in 1972. He joined the Aquino government briefly. But historical revision sometimes comes in a full circle. So about a decade ago, Enrile, who is now Marcos Jr.'s chief presidential legal counsel, flipped sides again and claimed that the ambush had indeed occurred. Now, flash forward to 2022. Technical problems with vote counting machines, vote buying, pockets of violence, and online disinformation marred the 2022 elections. Still, independent election observers note that the elections took place in a vibrant campaign environment. Former Vice President Maria Leonor Robredo, who had been leader of the opposition and Marcos Jr.'s strongest rival for president, mobilized hundreds of thousands of supporters in large street rallies of the campaign, the largest street rallies of the campaign. Robredo had defeated Mr. Marcos, after all, in the 2016 vice presidential race, but by a very thin margin. Her campaign offered a focus for pro-democracy forces that had protested the war on drugs and other human rights violations, but until the elections lacked a unifying leader. Ultimately, Robredo lost the 2022 race at a distant second place with 15 million votes, or about 28% of voter share. Arugay and Bakisal, in a 2022 article, offer insight into a key factor in the equation: the role of social media, especially disinformation, in driving voter support for Marcos Jr. and undermining other candidates, Robredo in particular. Meanwhile, attacks and pressures on academic freedom in the Philippines escalated in the months around the June 2022 transition from the presidency of Duterte to Marcos Jr. And these threats have included red tagging, anti-terrorism legislation, and censorship that undermine academic freedom and, more broadly, freedom of expression. During this period, concerns grew of scholars and academic institutions being the target of a decades-long practice known as red tagging, whereby perceived opponents of the government are labeled as communists or terrorists, subversive. International government bodies, including the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the European Parliament, have recognized the practice as a threat to civil society and freedom of expression, as a particular threat in the Philippines. Now, the academic community's concerns over red tagging are in response to violent attacks and even extrajudicial killings, as well as targeted harassment and intimidation that members of the education community have suffered. For instance, in February 2022, soldiers killed 2 volunteer teachers, Chad Book and Joja Rain Alcen Muho, 3 others as well, at a school for Lumad, or indigenous peoples' children. Book had been red tagged in the past and had been a petitioner in a challenge to the constitutionality of the Anti-Terrorism Act filed with the Supreme Court, which I'll return to in a minute. Shortly after the May 9 presidential elections, in another case of threat to academic freedom, Lorraine Badoy, the spokesperson for the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or NTF-LCAP, insinuated that Jean Encinas Franco, an associate professor of political science at the University of the Philippines in Diliman, my colleague, may be a communist, given Franco's comments to the media that support for opposition candidates like Leni Robredo could continue to endure beyond the polls. Badoy's comments were followed by internet users harassing Encinas Franco and her family, as well as false news reports that she'd been fired from the University of the Philippines due to her media statements. The university and media outlets corrected the disinformation. Meanwhile, shortly after that, in July, online trolls harassed historians like Ambeth Ocampo of the Ateneo de Manila University for confronting historical revisionism that tended to glorify the Marcos dictatorship. So trolling was one clear sort of outcome around the campaigns and in the aftermath of the election, targeted in particular at academics. In addition to these attempts to discredit and harass individual members of the higher education community, the renewed concerns over red tagging also stemmed from the government's abrogation of its 1989 accord with the University of the Philippines in January 2021, dismantling guarantees against unwarranted military and police presence on the university's campus and on the university's campuses, and most importantly, prohibiting the military and police from interfering with any peaceful protests within the premises of the university. Shortly after the government abrogated the accord, the NTF, LCAC, and other officials red tagged 4 major universities as communist recruitment grounds, further raising concerns about threats against those university communities and undermining public trust in higher education more generally. Just last February, Professor Melania Flores of the University of the Philippines in Diliman was arrested by police operatives in her residence within the UP campus over an alleged failure to make Social Security payments for a domestic worker in her household, and those charges were eventually dropped. So this was clearly a case of harassment. Flores had just ended her term as academic union president at the time. And about a year after the National Defense Department abrogated the accord with the university, it was also sending a message that, that agreement was really not going to be respected anymore. Now, compounding concerns over red tagging is a controversial Anti-Terrorism Act of 2010 that was largely upheld by the Supreme Court in December 2021, following multiple legal challenges. So members of the higher education community argue that the law contains vague and overly broad provisions on the definition of terrorism and related acts, inimical to academic freedom and human rights. For example, Section 9 provides a 12-year prison sentence for anyone deemed to be inciting others to commit terrorist acts through such means as speeches, writings, or banners, even without taking direct part in the commission of terrorism. And remember this, inciting others to commit terrorist acts is a punishable offense and a possible 12-year prison sentence. So teaching about dissent, activism, and revolution may be considered as incitement to terrorism under the new law. And the involvement of education authorities is an unprecedented inclusion of the academe and schools in the security sector's purview, creating a chilling effect on teaching, research, and activism. Given the current climate of red tagging and other campaigns vilifying academics as terrorists or traitors, state security forces may be emboldened to prosecute scholars and students under the Anti-Terrorism Act. Now, recent threats to academic freedom in the Philippines also include censorship of books. For example, in September in 2021, 3 public universities removed books with allegedly subversive content from their libraries and turned the materials over to the military. And the Commission on Higher Education urged other universities to do the same. Meanwhile, in August last year, the board of the Comisión sa Wikang Filipino, or the Commission for the Filipino Language, KWF, which is under the office of the president, so by this time it was President Marcos Jr., issued a memorandum and a resolution to stop the publication and distribution of 5 books it deemed as having subversive themes, explicit anti-Marcos and anti-Duterte contents. By the way, they didn't specify which Marcos, but it was basically Marcos Sr. because a lot of the books made references to the dictatorship and martial law. And the KWF said that these books incited terrorism under the Anti-Terrorism Act. To make matters worse, in a later memorandum, the KWF chairperson created an ad hoc review committee, including a representative from the Anti-Communist Task Force, NTF-LCAC, in order to assess additional books, the original 5 books plus 11 more. Now, since then, 3 out of 5 commissioners have withdrawn their signatures from the original memorandum, but it's unclear if this lifts the censorship of these books. And overall, censorship and other restrictions on scholars and students' access to information, including books and other sources, undermine academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and by extension, the future of quality higher education that can serve the public. Now, none of the authors have received any official communication about why the publication of their books had been halted, nor what will happen next. However, because of some leaks, the authors seem to have an idea of what specific words or parts of the text may have been particularly objectionable. So, as an example, in Dr. Romel Rodriguez's book, Kalatas, or Messages, a collection of vignettes, pointed fables, and ironic parables, one chapter is called Pag-akyat ng Mundo, or roughly translated, The Climbing of Mountains. Rodriguez is a multi-awarded writer, associate professor of the Departamento ng Filipino at Panitikan ng Pilipinas, or Department of Filipino and Philippine Literature of the University of the Philippines, as well as former director of the Centro ng Wikang Filipino, or Center for Philippine Language of the university. And the other authors have a very similar profile. Now, in his book, he encourages the reader not to think twice about climbing a mountain. Huwag tayong magdalawang isip na umakyat ng bundok. He talks about the beauty of what one can see up in the mountains, the fresh air, the delicious food that the local communities might invite one to eat, the languages and customs one may learn from local farmers and indigenous people. Then he closes by saying, may iba't ibang dahilan ng tao kung bakit sila umaakyat ng bundok. Ang iba para mamasyal, ang maghanap ng adventure, ang saglit na takasan ang buhay sa syudad. May iba para matuto, para magsaliksik, requirement sa klase, o project para makagraduate. So there are different reasons why people go up the mountains, sometimes to learn or for research, or maybe a requirement for a class or project to finish in order to graduate. May umakyat ng bundok upang hanapin ang musang mailap at bihirang makita, saying some do it to find rare inspiration. At may umaakyat ng bundok upang humawak ng sandata. And some go up the mountain to take up arms. Rodriguez is convinced that the word sandata, or arms or weapons, was one of the triggers for the KWF's censorship. I think it may well be that umakyat ng bundok or namundo, to go up the mountains, is a well-worn euphemism for joining the communist insurgency, and that could have also been one of the triggers. The fate of Rodriguez's book, along with the 4 others, is unclear, but none of the books seem to be on their way to being published, despite the voiding of the KWF resolution. So how has a Marcos return constrained academic freedom in the Philippines? The new dispensation attenuates and accentuates state repression targeted at left-wing as well as liberal, small l, not the party, liberal groups or individuals. Much of the escalation of repressiveness occurred already under the Duterte administration. Although there were earlier periods of violent repression, particularly under former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who is an ally of the current incumbents. The contestation over martial law memory creates new and pronounced risks for academic freedom, because the truth about martial law and dictatorship is what's at stake. This political conflict is particularly apparent over the changing meanings of who is subversive. Recalling Proclamation 1081 of 1972, the Martial Law Proclamation invoked an old Anti-Subversion Act from the 50s. In the 1984 book, Testament from a Prison Cell, a collection of Ninoy Aquino's writings, letters, and case files during his imprisonment, Aquino quotes a Supreme Court ruling on the anti-subversion law under which he was charged. He quotes, "We cannot overemphasize the need for prudence and circumspection in the enforcement of the Anti-Subversion Act, operating as it does in the sensitive areas of freedom of expression and belief." In fact, Aquino points out that Philippine lawmakers sought to repeal the bill in a campaign that spanned 1970 to 1971 on the eve of the declaration of martial law. Yet ultimately, the Supreme Court, a year after martial law had been declared, upheld the anti-subversion law as constitutional. A military commission convicted Aquino, and in 1977, sentenced him to death by firing squad. Then he was allowed to leave the Philippines in 1980. So in 1983, Aquino had known he was returning to almost certain death one way or another. So probably to be considered by the state and the dominant authorities as subversive, one must first be a dissident. Historian Renato Constantino, in a 1970 classic tract, Dissent and Counter-Consciousness, argued for dissent as a commitment to change in a constant search for a better life in freedom and democracy. He argues that activism without definable fundamental goals and the corresponding theory of society is nothing. And criticism without active protest is an academic exercise without lasting value. Activists, therefore, have to become critics, zealously studying present reality as it evolved from the past, so they may thoroughly understand the society that they are trying to change. Meanwhile, academic critics have to make a study of both the present and the past in order to be able to guide activism. Thus, in a way, activists have to be scholars and scholars have to be activists. Scholars can no longer be isolated, and activists can no longer be atheoretical. Each must assimilate the virtue of the other in order to become more productive, more creative. Constantino also imagines that no matter how brutally dissent is repressed, change will occur. But repression has been particularly violent against the left today and historically. For the left, in fact, People Power in '86 or APSA was a defeat of sorts because their absence from the revolt reduced their influence in post-authoritarian politics. They decided to stay on the sidelines of the 1986 elections and boycotted the whole thing. So the trajectory of left-wing dissent against the Marcos dictatorship complicates the building of alliances and solidarity to resist because of a split that broke off those no longer willing to continue an armed rebellion, as well as violent internal purges. And so recovering the history of the Marcos era left, as Claudio notes, records and acknowledges the leadership of the anti-dictatorship struggle for most of the martial law period, but also their use of violence. And so tagging dissidents, intellectuals, activists, and the like as red or communist, therefore subversive, is used to justify any form of ill treatment, including violence, and isolates the target by sowing fear of violence. And the risks increase the farther one is from the capital in Manila. For example, in February 2019, the University of the Philippines, Cebu professor and former Academic Union Cebu chapter president, Dr. Phoebe Zoe Sanchez, was harassed by suspected security agents during a people power commemoration and protests in Cebu City. A month after, the university's gates were vandalized, accusing the university community of being rebels and communist sympathizers. In another case, in 2016, state forces red-tagged Professor Arnold Alamon, a sociology professor at Mindanao State University's Iligan Institute of Technology, as well as colleagues conducting research on indigenous people's rights, mining, and conflict. Printed leaflets and Facebook posts vilified Alamon as a communist propagandist. Alamon was also warned that the military's order of battle included a list of academics, therefore included him. Harassed online and threatened with harm, Alamon relocated temporarily, discontinued his research, and stopped writing an opinion column for a local newspaper. And so revisionism and more recent attacks on academic freedom have intertwined resistance to the Marcos rehabilitation on one hand with red tagging. And for this reason, revisionism contains a coercive element, a threat of violence. Now, Aguilar observes that Marcos loyalists have disseminated their narrative through social media and other technologies to reach members of the younger generation who have no personal experience or memory of the Marcos regime, the Marcos Sr. regime. On YouTube, for example, videos extolling Marcos Sr.'s supposedly incomparable leadership, the achievements of martial law, the illogicality of Marcos ordering Ninoy Aquino's assassination because they were friends. Imelda Marcos's explanation of the family's wealth as being due to Marcos's extraordinary acumen at trading gold, or Marcos Jr.'s dismissal of accusations against him and his father as mere political propaganda. Another study of online sources unravels, as Aguilar observes, the narrative structure of the Marcos loyalists' version of history, which they understand in terms of a glorious past under Marcos, a fall supposedly orchestrated by the Aquinos, or a yellow Diliman conspiracy, the color associated with the Liberal Party and Aquino, and the dark present, where Marcos is said to be a victim of Black propaganda. And so Aguilar sees this as a particularly moving and effective narrative of possession, lost, and a reclamation of a once great nation, or Bagong Lipunan. Narratives spreading of a Marcos Sr. having presided over a golden age was also, according to another study by Mendoza, one of the top disinformation themes on TikTok. Moreover, Verifiles, a fact-checking media organization, reported that most election-related disinformation is spread through Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, but benefiting Marcos Jr. because the most popular posts included misleading claims about the family wealth and the denial of atrocities committed during martial law. Now, there are other media, not just online. For instance, Senator Amy Marcos, portrayed in the background here, well, that's her on the right and then portrayed on the left, was the producer of a movie last year made in Malacanang, which depicted the last days of the Marcoses in the presidential palace before fleeing the country in 1986. A movie replete with misleading half-truths and outright falsehoods. In fact, it included an improbable scene with Cory Aquino playing mahjong with Carmelite nuns after pointedly ordering the U.S. government to get them, meaning the Marcoses, get them out of the Philippines. But when the movie came out, so did another film, Tips, which portrayed student activism and repression under martial law. Similarly, when the same director of Made in Malacanang screened a new film this year, Ninoy Aquino, Martyr or Murderer, director Joel Lamangan, himself a student activist during the dictatorship years, released a movie about ordinary victims of martial law horas de peligro, or hour of danger, are exactly at the same time. So like a game of chess, when one side makes a move, the other makes a counter move. Revisionism provokes a response, just as repression sometimes sparks protest. Online, there are a number of initiatives, such as Tanggol Kasaysayan, or Defend History, Tanggol Wika, Defend Language, the Alliance of Concerned Teachers, Congress of Teachers and Educators for Nationalism and Democracy, working particularly on academic freedom and the protection of teachers. Another example of groups that fight disinformation, Academia at Bayan Contra Disinformacion at Dayaan, or the Academe and Nation Against Disinformation and Corruption or Cheating. There's also the online Ateneo Martial Law Museum, Project Gunita or Project Memory, as well as other efforts to build digital archives of extant documents on martial law. I myself am a member of the Network in Defense of Historical Truth and Academic Freedom, and we want to maintain and expand the monitoring of threats to academic freedom that we are currently doing, especially to document and respond to cases outside Manila, respond with solidarity when we can. Despite the KWF suppression of supposedly subversive books, there's also been a surge of new publications on martial law, particularly since 2016. No coincidence, the start of the Duterte administration, and as well a likely response to the burial of Marcos Sr. in the Libingan ng mga Bayani as a hero. And as well, another surge around the 50th anniversary of the declaration of martial law last year. So you can see some of these books, the Marcos Era, a reader, which Jojo Abinales, who was another lecturer in this series, co-edited. The Marcos Technocrats by Tessa Tadem, this really excellent publication, part compendium of documents and probing analysis, Marcos Lies, by Ariarte and other authors, Ariarte Reyes and one more author, but published by the Third World Studies Center. Martial Law at 50, published by the Ibon Foundation. False Nostalgia, written by economist J.C. Punong Bayan. These are some examples. And in fact, this presentation that I'm making today may be the basis for a chapter in a new book on martial law if everything works out. Okay. So in conclusion, the 2022 national and local elections in the Philippines returned the Marcos dynasty to power, decades after a popular revolt ousted Ferdinand Marcos in 1986. So how has the return affected academic freedom in the Philippines? I examined selected episodes in which academic freedom was threatened recently to exemplify growing trends in censorship, intimidation, and violence that constrain free expression within an environment of coercive revisionism, especially about facts pertaining to martial law and the legacy of the elder Marcos. And I think the last thing I'd like to highlight is the fact that this revisionism has provoked a sort of renaissance in the art, literature, and Marcos era studies. We're producing new books. There are new solidarity initiatives, and scholars heighten public engagement to resist revisionism. So these also are among the legacies of martial rule in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this incredible, challenging, and actually multiple times very moving talk. As other folks are formulating questions, I had two that I wanted to ask. I'll ask at least one, and then of course cede the floor to other people if they put questions in the Q&A, which is, I'm really struck by the historical comparison between what's happening now and what happened under Marcos. And I wondered, you know, as a scholar of authoritarianism, how do you do you see the present moment as, and the kinds of techniques that are being used as marking a clean break, or in a sense, being continuous with the past? And in particular, I was struck by the way in which you described in a sense, the almost indiscriminate use of red tagging to identify anything seen as dissident or anti-Duterte or anti-Marcos. So yeah, I wonder, and of course, it makes me think comparatively about the region too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. There are parallels with the past, but also important discontinuities. So the parallels from the past, yes, do include this sort of red tagging and the military advancing this narrative that universities are the breeding ground for communism, basically, as a pretext to intervene more on campuses. And in one of the books that I mentioned, Marcos Lies, there's a really wonderful section that juxtaposes the history of military sort of what they call obsession with the University of the Philippines in particular, because they would attack the University of the Philippines as a sort of deterrent for activism and a means of controlling other universities, other students, and other academics, right? So they talk about measures that the Marcos government had done even before the declaration of martial law, like trying to interfere in campus elections or with campus journalism, for instance. And then, of course, when martial law was declared, they simply arrested students and faculty members and banned campus publications and banned the student council and so on, right? And so that's why when the Department of National Defense abrogated this agreement with the university, an agreement that was struck in the post-dictatorship period, this brings back a lot of trauma and fear that, and in the context of renewed red tagging, this kind of violent, authoritarian sort of approach to controlling dissent, protest, and academic and student activism or scholarship might be, there might be a return of that, right? Now, what are the breaks? What are the discontinuities? A key difference is that we're not really seeing a clear power grab, Now that's a little complicated because under the Duterte government, like possibly as many as 30,000 people killed in the street is not something you would normally see even in the weakest democracy, right? But at the same time, Duterte didn't stay in office. He ostensibly transferred power in an election, but to an ally that continued to cover his back, right? And so we do see signs that it is democracy backsliding, but not in an erosion, slow kind of way. Something a bit more sharp and pronounced, yet not fully collapse into authoritarianism. Because, for example, even on one hand, if these books that had anti-Duterte or anti-Marcos content were banned, books still are being published on martial law. I can still talk about it. We can still talk about it freely here. So it is that sort of strangeness of democratic deconsolidation, democratic backsliding that makes it a little more difficult for us to really engage with what is happening and draw clear lines and decide what to do about it.
Thank you so much. It reminds me that there will be no shortage of work for the activist scholars that are so needed. So in the interim, several questions have come into the Q&A. So actually, there's two on revisionism. So the first is, thanks so much for such a thorough and thought-provoking presentation as always. I was wondering if you could speak to some of the conditions that allow revisionism to flourish and whether these conditions remain consistent over time or get adapted.
Yeah. One big factor, of course, is time elapsed since 1972, right? Or since 1986. In electoral terms, for instance, the number of voters who had no direct memory of martial law, if I'm not mistaken, constituted the majority of voters in the 2022 election. And so there's that. Other factors include, of course, as I mentioned earlier, something, unfortunately, that the Philippines as a case has gained notoriety for as a petri dish or patient zero for online disinformation and electoral interference. It's the high level of social media penetration, internet penetration, as well as social media penetration and usage in the country. The active, and there's research that has been producing evidence on this since the 2016 elections. Evidence that there are organized, networked attempts at really changing the narrative, particularly benefiting Marcos Jr. and the Marcos legacy in general. There's also been evidence that in the 2016 it benefited Duterte. And what's very clear is that throughout the Duterte administration and in the 2022 election in particular, it targeted someone like Leni Robredo with like sort of black propaganda and that sort of. So yeah, I mean, these are very empirical. Sometimes when you're, yeah, so I mean, I think I'll just leave it there and maybe we can have more of a comparative discussion later on.
So a related question is, and related to the question on revisionism, how effective are efforts to counter the lies of historical revisionism, not in terms of fact for fact, but in terms of capturing the popular discourse and effectively encouraging the general public to care and to link the present day challenges to the legacy of martial law?
Yeah. I'm afraid not very effective, particularly if you look at the outcome of the 2022 election, because there was a lot of effort at fact-checking disinformation, for example. And as I said, like the books that have been produced, for instance, I mean, these are wonderful works of archival research in many cases, or ethnographic work. But the popular imagination, as the question seemed to refer to, there's a gap, right? And this gap is not easily bridged because of the amount of resources that seems to be, on one hand, the amount of resources that seem to be poured into like these organized campaigns of disinformation that have huge knock-on effects, which means that, you know, one lie grows and spreads at a disproportionate rate than the truth, let's say. And so even if academics and civil society groups work hard to counter it, there is a huge imbalance in our efforts. And then the second thing is, while social media networks and platforms seem to be addressing these sorts of issues in other countries, the same can't be said for the Philippines, you know? And no one is actually really taking them to task. You know, we don't have the equivalent of having our Congress, you know, effectively have someone like Mark Zuckerberg answer for this. People like Maria Ressa, who was a co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, she does what she can. But I mean, there is again that sort of huge imbalance, especially when there is sort of a profit-driven reason why misinformation spreads.
Absolutely. Another related question is, are there other cases of revisionist history of Philippine politics written by academics? How about revisionist history written by non-academics?
I'm not sure if that means perhaps revisionist history on other periods of history, right? So there's a lot of contestation over the Second World War, for instance. Not as much as martial law, but there's a certain amount of that because of the collaborators still being part of the oligarchy, for example. And yeah, sure. I mean, there's and this kind of work, as you know, I mean, given that the relatively free and open, relatively, when I look around the region, relatively free and open space for research and scholarship in the Philippines, you know, of course, there's going to be contestation, right? But I think that some scholarly consensuses are clearer over the Second World War, and certainly until recently were much clearer over martial law, which has happened in living memory, right? Yeah. Revisionist history written by non-academics. I mean, yes, I suppose so. I'm just not as familiar with this, but I suppose there would be a lot of that too. But you know, the most effective is not actually written by academics. The most effective revisionism is what is popularly and easily accessible.
Another question that came in the chat is, during the Marcos senior regime, there was already control of thought in the writing of books, as I had experienced. What clearly is the difference between the control of academic freedom under the Marcos junior regime and the senior?
Yeah. So again, it's like the difference between an outright authoritarian regime and something that, you know, some would maybe describe it as an illiberal democracy, or there seems to be a growing consensus that the Philippines is a competitive authoritarian regime by now, or an electoral autocracy. But you know, the difference between utter collapse and like this sort of backsliding into illiberalism, you don't have that outright censorship, except in that weird Commission ng Wikang Filipino case, which provoked the backlash, right? And which resulted in some of those commissioners actually changing their position. But yeah, I mean, apart from that, and hopefully, you know, the sort of backlash deters further sort of blatant attempts at outright censorship. You know, there's still enough space. There's still enough space.
That is slightly hopeful. Another question that has come in is that there are those who say that both sides, pro and anti-Marcos groups, are guilty of mis or disinformation and so-called revisionism about the Marcos era, but only the anti-Marcos groups who dominate the academia and the media are the ones often heard. What can you say about that? Yeah.
So, you know, there were periods, right? At some point, I quoted Leloy Claudio, for instance. He was writing against this sort of dominant post-EDSA consensus that up until Duterte, let's say, seemed to, and especially considering that Cory Aquino and Ninoy Aquino's son, this is going to be confusing for people who aren't familiar with the Philippines, Noynoy Aquino, was president from 2010 to 2016, right? So it seemed for a while, and you know, there was a swing of the pendulum, right? Where the dominant and sort of, the dominant discourse was one that promoted only the, let's say, only the truth of that conformed with the post-EDSA consensus. I think my nuance or my take on that is that nonetheless, there is a sort of, because all narratives, or all memory, right? All history, there is a choice about what about we remember and what we decide to forget, what gets pushed to the margins, right? So, for instance, the role of the left and our sort of the role of the left as a force, as an anti-dictatorship force, and then its sort of role in politics after 1986. Our understandings of this change. But this was marginalized to some extent during that sort of post-86, pre-2016, I would just call it as a shorthand democratic sort of interregnum between dictatorship and democratic backsliding under Duterte. But it wasn't completely, obliterated either, right? And there was this tension between, were the left, members of the left, simply subversive, or were they heroes and dissidents, right? So I think that, and it's sort of difficult also to simply couch it as pro or anti-Marcos. Another way of slicing that might be pro-human rights and or pro-democracy or conservative versus progressive or liberal, depending on the definition of conservative. Yeah, so I think ultimately there still is more space and less utter, like complete bald lies and falsehoods. There's nothing really protecting that post EDSA consensus in the same way that the Marcos rehabilitation is being done.
The next question is, thanks so much for such an important and timely talk. My question is regarding the difference between censorship and what one might call compelled speech. What instances have you seen of legislators, other officials, etc., appearing to be compelled to propagate the martial law false narrative? There's been a good deal of falsification of history via online trolls, bots, simple loyalists, etc. But what about from pressure on public officials and an official public discourse in general?
Yeah. Actually, again, going back to the Commission ng Wikang Filipino or KWF case, that was, some people have been sort of surmising that is actually more of a case of, how should I put it? People, opportunists, who wanted to sideline some officials within the commission associated with these books, right, that openly criticize, let's say, martial law and Duterte. So it may have been a sort of, on one hand, like one layer of it was internal politicking. But at least the more exterior layer of that is that some of those officials felt somewhere maybe between compelled and like sort of just being opportunist about it to sort of mouth what they may have assumed would be the administration line. Because this is fairly early, this occurred fairly early in the Marcos Jr. administration. There are some analysts that argue that Marcos Jr., first of all, he has no interest in declaring martial law. I mean, the whole point of his presidency, or like sort of, ruling in an outright authoritarian manner, right? Whether or not he declares martial law. Because the whole point of the last 30 years for the Marcos is was this rehabilitation. And in many ways, I mean, there's some truth to that, at least from what we can see in some of Marcos Jr.'s speeches and lip service even to democracy. Well, okay, lip service to democracy. Maybe that's a little harsh, but a sort of narrative on democracy on one hand that you didn't see at all from Duterte, who outright attacked it, right? But the reason why I do say it is sort of rhetorical as well, is that if you look at how Marcos Jr. has dealt with justice issues of actual human rights, and then institutionalizing, as I argue elsewhere, institutionalizing impunity for Duterte, right? Because Duterte, protecting himself, because he's the one who was directly involved in these accusations of human rights violations, is one thing, right? That's personalistic, that's particularistic. Marcos Jr. is a completely different administration. And with the tools and instruments of the state, he's institutionalized impunity for his predecessor so far. So yeah, and so it's really around justice, maybe not specifically towing some kind of official line on martial law, but certainly what the Justice Department, the Solicitor General, those government agencies that have to deal with the International Criminal Court, right? They have been very clearly towing an official line that is completely false, which is that there has been justice over the war on drugs, that there is no systematic murder of those thousands of people who are actually in fact dead, right? And so on and so forth. Those are very, very clear falsehoods that the government has been consistently mouthing.
I think when you say that, it makes me think I would say go with that Marcos Jr. only pays lip service to democracy. I think it's the right term. A related question is, have there been attempts to rehabilitate Imelda Marcos?
Yeah. Imelda Marcos, I think on Broadway, Here Lies Love is going to be revived. So Imelda Marcos has her image. I was just reading, I can't remember the author off the top of my head, but there has been a transformation in some ways of Imelda Marcos's sort of public persona or image, right? From being one half of the conjugal dictatorship, right, to something that's more like of a celebrity status. And so perhaps in some ways that if these are as they are probably likely to be well-engineered image rehabilitation attempts, it neutralizes the sort of political deficits that she has, right? From her association with the Marcos dictatorship, and recasts her as more of like, and in part what she's always been, a figure of glamour, a celebrity, I hope I'm not misquoting her, but I think something has been attributed to her, something like, we need to be glamorous. Okay, this is not a verbatim quote, but we need to be glamorous so that the poor can look up at something, beautiful from the mud or something along those lines, right? So I think, and that neutralizes the sort of, any sort of negative political attitudes around her, makes her a little irrelevant politically, but only like, again, that sort of feel-good thing that had sort of dominated the Marcos Jr. campaign, where he didn't participate in any debates, or at least not in any debates that he thought were serious. He got tripped up and on what he thought was friendly ground by socialist candidates, actually. But he didn't engage in any of the major debate platforms. For instance, he tried very mightily not to engage in any serious way with the media, and it was all about unity, 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 or very close to that. There were some sector-specific appeals, but these were not very widely broadcasted enough to gain some specific sectoral support. But generally speaking, Bongbong Marcos Jr. and all the, what we've been seeing online in terms of that rehabilitation of the Marcos family in general, it's been like, this feel-good campaign. Yes, on one hand, portraying the Marcoses as victims of politicking and just Black propaganda. But generally, it's been like positive messages and that sort of.
So fascinating, because in some ways being irrelevant itself is a positive in sort of in comparison to other representations of her. Another question has come, which is, while there is a resurgence of literature and media that problematizes the Marcos legacy, one must be honest in confronting that these are the same talking points post-86, i.e. remembering martial law is getting old. While being honest to history cannot beat the inventiveness of disinformation campaigns, I must ask, what is the role of narrative in all this? Can you say that Katips and Horas de Peligro reinvent the martial law narrative to the benefit of the cause?
Okay, just on those particular movies. So Katips and Horas de Peligro, a couple of movies that I mentioned earlier that came out sort of in response to pro-Marcos films. In terms of those movies, I don't think they necessarily reinvent the martial law narrative. So something that Aguilar, a historian, also talks about in terms of the problem with the sort of pro-democracy camp in comparison to the Marcos camp. The Marcos camp has an effective narrative. It's like a redemption arc, right? And it's true, even if there is a resurgence of literature and media, it's that tries to evoke, or describe or analyze or explain what the Philippines had gone through during the dictatorship. There's not really much of a new narrative. I think that if anything, these kinds of works or attempts at trying to address deliberate disinformation, they're on the back foot, because all of a sudden there's all this just dealing with lies about what happened in the past, as if we don't even have a common baseline, to start from, that this happened, people died, human rights were violated. Marcos declared martial law to remain in power, not because of all these threats from the left and the right. I mean, his desire in his last term to stay in power created the unrest, right? The clear example is what I talked about earlier, right? This sort of change in the narrative. There was an ambush of the Secretary of Defense, and we must declare a martial law. And then Enrile, who sides, who is in danger at some point from Marcos, and sides briefly with Cory Aquino, suddenly admits that, it was just a fabrication. And then 10 years ago, again, returns. And the fact that he, returns to the lie, and the fact that he can do that and apparently it works, means that, the truth isn't that compelling a narrative when set against the more effective Marcos narrative on one hand, but also the very materially driven concerted campaign. I'm sorry, I have nothing more, more considered than that. But yeah, I mean, it's like refreshing our remembrance of martial law rather than providing really new, insights. The new insights are probably mostly of interest to us academics, right? Rather than necessarily the public in general, because
I'm mindful of time, and so I will take the privilege of being the moderator to conclude with a question of my own, which I think dovetails very much with what you just said, which is, I was really struck by your description of the relationship between scholars and activists and the need for scholars to be activists and activists to be scholars. It strikes me that particularly in a moment like this, when the truth is, when the sort of the truth of violence and repression has become somehow not compelling, that's particularly essential. And so I wondered if you would just say a little bit more about, about what that looks like and how, in a sense, how to build a community of scholar activists and activist scholars.
I think, at least personally, I came into activism partly after living in Singapore for 20 years, where I couldn't express myself as openly politically. And then coming home to the Philippines and not wanting to be cheated out of that little freedom, or at least the relative freedom, but seeing that space close. And so for myself and for the people that I work with, and for the cases that we get to know about, scholars at risk, right? I wanted to lend my solidarity, and also in the hopes, and honestly in the fear that one day I might need other people's solidarity with me. And I think it's also a large part that I work on political violence. That is my main sort of area of research. Particularly political violence in the last 20 years or so. And how I've read case files from the Commission on Human Rights, read names of people that I know, people that I went to college with, being on orders of battle, right? Targets of the military for possible summary execution. Somehow bring, and coming home, right, and interacting with these people in some cases. To me, it brings home the importance of a sense of history as well, because that, I sometimes reading about martial law and what happened in the past, for me is in the back of my mind, it's a preparation for what we might need to face in the future, hopefully not. But yeah, and that's why this idea that scholars can't afford to be isolated, and we need to extend ourselves. I think that's where I come.
Solidarity is essential. Sort of always and forever, and in more expanding ways. I wish that we were all in a room, and so that we could actually all applaud to thank you for such an incredible and difficult lecture, and for a reminder of the significance of truth, for the significance of academic work that bears witness to truth, and that is intertwined with with the struggles that people are facing in their daily lives. Thank you so much for your talk, for the great exchange around questions. It was really fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for the opportunity, first of all. And thank you so much to the audience for the fantastic engagement. I hope I answered your questions to the best. Well, I hope
You were
that one okay.
And just before I end, I will just say, please join us in 2 weeks for Dr. Mary McCoy's presentation, and you can find the information about how to register in the same places where you found the instructions to register for this one, either on our website or on Twitter or Facebook. And for everyone for whom it's nighttime, have a good rest of the evening. For those who are starting your day, have an excellent day. Thank you so much.